to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, PhD equine nutritionist and horse owner. So I have 7 of the gorgeous creatures that live here with me. And one of the things that I am constantly watching in my horses, and I know you are too, is the condition of their coats. So this episode is going to be looking at all of the different things that can make our horses' coats go yuck, and all of the things we can do to have our horses' coats rather, beautiful and shiny and just have that gleam about them that makes you not want to look away. So I was out with my horses last night. I rode my gorgeous little Dellinger, who was one of my paints, and I'll talk about her a little bit in this episode. But truly, it was full moon last night, the most spectacular full moon. I was out riding when it came up, and it was a huge, huge full moon. It was so beautiful. And by the time we'd gotten home and we'd unsaddled and brushed and done all the things after a ride, the moon was fully out. It was quite dark, but the moon was out. And Dellinger's coat was so shiny that it was just glistening in the moonlight. I'm like, oh my goodness, I love this time of year because their coats usually are very beautiful. But it made me realise how much I value a shiny coat. And it's not just because it looks stunning. I mean, it really does look stunning. They're stunning creatures anyway, but when they're shiny and dappled and beautiful, they just are something that I find it hard to look away from. But it's functional too, in that a horse with a very shiny coat is telling us that more than likely they are very healthy on the inside. So it's like their little, not mirrors, not the right word, but it's like the way that they can tell us, I guess, how healthy they are on the inside. It's a little bit like top line. So in our podcast episode with Dr. Nicole, where we talk about back health, top line is something that is so beautiful on a horse. You know, horses with good top lines are stunning animals, but top line is also so functional. You know, it holds their spine together and makes sure that their back stays strong and healthy. So it's a little bit like coat. You know, sometimes we can feel that we're feeding for coat condition just to have a shiny coat and make the horse look beautiful. But in actual fact, what we're doing is feeding to make sure that the horse is healthy. And our reward almost as the human is that we get this stunning shiny coat on the outside to tell us that our horse is nice and healthy on the inside. So first of all, I want to talk about some of the things that can make your horse's coat look terrible. And they may or may not be things that you need to be worried about. So the first one is change of season. So sometimes at the end of change of season, our horse's coats can look pretty ordinary, and that's normal. It may be an indication of something not quite right, but sometimes you just have to hold your nerve for a little while without panicking about what might be wrong with your horse because their coat looks so bad until you get through that change of season. So to give you an example of this, my gorgeous Dellinger, who is a paint, she came to me as a yearling in very neglected conditions. So she would have been a condition score of maybe 2.5 on the Henneke 1 to 9 scale. So she was really very skinny. And it was October. So in Australia, that's our change of season from winter into summer. So she should have been losing her winter coat, but it was late October and she still had this terribly rough, quite long coat as a yearling, and she looked terrible. And I thought that, you know, that was because she was very neglected, and I'm sure part of it was because she was very neglected. But what this little girl has shown me consistently for the last 4 years, so they've just turned 5, and what she has shown me consistently is that her coat will be like that at the end of spring. And she will hang on to her winter coat and hang on to it and hang on to it. And then just one day, it's like she goes, okay, I'm ready to take my jacket off now. And you can brush her and you're just brushing massive handfuls of hair out of her coat. And underneath is the most stunning black coat you have ever seen for a horse that is unrugged and has fed a very, very plain diet. She has not fed anything in particular to make her coat beautiful. She just has this beautiful coat. But honestly, if you saw her right before she shed her coat, you would think that there was something wrong with her because her coat is so rough and it's brown as opposed to being black. And it's curly on the ends. It looks terrible. But what I have to remind myself is, 1, this just seems to be her. It's a characteristic that she has. And 2, she's unrugged. So she goes right through all of her seasons without wearing a rug, which means that that coat has been out in the elements for an entire season. So probably, if we left ourselves out in the elements for an entire season, we'd be looking a little bit worse for wear as well. But the coat has been exposed to all of the elements, and it's essentially dead or dying by the time it gets to the end of the season and getting ready to fall out. So she's just a little bit unique. So I wanted to mention her, but most horses when you get to a change of season will have a coat that just doesn't look as wonderful as it did at the beginning of the season, because it's getting a little bit worn out, particularly if your horses are unrugged. So do keep that in mind. If you're looking at your horse and thinking, oh, their coat looks a bit yuck, just do a little bit of a mental check with yourself to see, well, where are we in our seasons and our change of seasons, and are we coming up to where they're about to shed, a winter coat for a summer coat, or shed a summer coat for a winter coat. And, it may be, if everything else that we're about to talk about is ticked off, it may just be that your horse's coat is looking ordinary because they're about to drop that coat and have their beautiful new coat underneath. The second thing that can make horses' coats look very ordinary is a nutrient deficiency. So there are lots and lots of nutrients that are involved with skin and coat health, but probably if I asked you which nutrients come to mind, you would say, well, copper and zinc, and you'd be absolutely correct. So copper and zinc are both very important. Copper really important for colour, and zinc is important for, we could almost say, pretty much everything. It's a super important nutrient, but definitely very important for coat health and also skin health. So those two minerals work hand in hand, I guess, and also interact together. So we need to be careful that they're in the correct ratio with one another. In the diet, we need to make sure that your horse is getting enough of them in their diet. And what's really handy to remember is that it doesn't matter where a forage analysis comes from around the world. Pretty much every single forage analysis I have ever looked at in my time, which would be up in the thousands by now in my career, I could count them on one hand, the number of forages I've seen that have got enough copper and or enough zinc in there to meet a horse's minimum nutrient requirements. So nearly every forage available doesn't contain enough copper to meet a horse's minimum requirements for long-term health. So obviously there's enough in there to keep them functioning on some level. But what you'll find is that horses that are copper or zinc deficient, or both, is that they'll just have dull coats that are not as coloured as they should be. So your classic example is a black horse that is brown instead of black, or your chestnuts who, should be that rich red, and there's lots of different shades of chestnut, but let's say, a chestnut who should be a rich red colour ends up kind of a burnt orange colour. For anyone who is interested in or knows cattle, Hereford cattle are brilliant for showing you where copper deficiency might exist, which is, like I said, pretty much everywhere, but you'll see Hereford cows, when they're in really copper deficient country, they go orange, where they should also be a really rich red colour. So if you see orange Herefords and not red Herefords, you can be pretty sure that any horse grazing in that area as well is going to be quite severely copper deficient. So it is really important that you meet all of the nutrients that your horse needs for a healthy coat. They're not the only nutrients. There's a broad spectrum of nutrients. So it makes feeding a balanced diet really important for overall health. And then when you feed a balanced diet and you've got an overall healthy horse, then they will usually show that to you by having a very shiny coat. And honestly, feeding a balanced diet is the most important thing you can do to make your horses healthy and therefore to have them have beautiful coats. We'll talk a little bit more about feeding for a healthy coat towards the end of the podcast, but if it feels overwhelming to know, well, how do I know whether my horse has got enough copper and zinc in its diet, or the other nutrients that are required for coat health, or not too much of certain nutrients? So I have seen vitamin A toxicity cause really sort of dandruffy, scurfy coats in racehorses in Japan. You can check all of that using the My Happy Horse nutrition app that was just officially released into the App Store today. So it was a very exciting day for us here at My Happy Horse. But Yeah, it'll check all of that. So it'll take into account your horse's pasture and hay and any supplements and feeds you're feeding, and it will literally just show you, yes, your horse is getting enough copper, or no, your horse is not getting enough copper, and therefore you need to add some more. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a sec. So the third thing that can cause pretty ordinary looking coats, and this is one that I struggle with a lot with a couple of my horses, is sun bleaching. The backstory on this for me is that my beautiful poet, he is a liver chestnut. He's the son of the horse that I had as an 8-year-old kid until I was, I had her until I was 35. She was the most beautiful girl. She was a liver chestnut, and Poet is her son, also a liver chestnut. So they've got these gorgeous coat. And in springtime, it's like velvet. It's so rich and so beautiful and so shiny. But what would happen with Poet is that we'd get maybe a week, 2 weeks into proper hot weather. So in Tamworth, New South Wales, where I'm from, it does get really hot. So we can get, in springtime, it's not uncommon to have days at 40 degrees Celsius plus, which I think is more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's pretty hot. And he would go a burnt orange. His coat and it would just look rough, lose its shine, lose its colour. And it literally had me pulling my hair out for years, just trying to figure out, it's like, why? I know that your diet is balanced, and I was thinking maybe I've got some mineral ratio wrong, or maybe he's got something wrong in his gut that I can't see. But then it was just one season, and the flies must have been really, really bad. We have had a number of summers in the last 10, 15 years where the flies have just been horrendous. So they wear fly masks. And I don't normally take my horse's fly masks off overnight because the flies are so bad that by the time I get back out to them in the morning, their eyes will already be irritated by flies. So Poet had worn, it's only during when the flies are really, really bad, I'll just leave them on all the time for them. And it was one of these periods of time, he had his fly mask on all the time. And it was really, really hot as well. So he would have been sweating, and particularly sweating around the little band that goes around behind the back of his ears. When I took that fly mask off, there was this dark liver chestnut band of hair underneath where that fly mask went. And then around at the base of his ears and to the back of where that band was sitting on his head, he was literally like almost a golden, almost like a dark palomino colour, because his hair was so bleached from the sweat. But where the sun couldn't get to, he was still liver chestnut. And at that point I went, this is what's been going on with you. So his coat bleaches really badly when he's sweaty and he's out in the sun, which, in our summers is a lot. And on that particular property where that happened, they didn't have a lot of shade. They had shade if they came up to their water point, but the rest of the time when they were out grazing, they were in the sun. So he bleaches really badly. And I've noticed in the last summer and coming into this summer now, where he would have already bleached by now quite badly because we have had quite a bit of hot weather. But I built them a large shelter shed. So he now spends large portions of the middle of the heat of the day standing in underneath this shelter shed. So he might be sweaty, but he's not in the sun. That has made a big difference. I know we could rug them. I don't have a need for his coat to be beautiful. He's not shown. So I don't put rugs on them. I just don't have a need to put rugs on them. So I don't, just for the sake of preserving his coat colour. That was sort of where I started really noticing how horses will bleach in the sun. And then in the last 12 months, a lay, an off-the-track thoroughbred, has come to live with us, and she is this glorious, almost black. So I think she would still be classified as dark brown, but she's almost black when you see her when she's got a really dark coat on. And coming into this spring, her coat was just amazing. Again, unrugged. The only time she would have a rug on is if we washed her before a show and we just wanted to keep her clean, but the rest of the time she's unrugged. So her spring coat had come through, and it was near black, and it was super shiny. And then we got a run of hot weather, and within, I'm going to say, the space of 7 days, she's now brown. And she's a horse that sweats heavily. So whenever on hot days, she'll just come up out of her paddock, and she's got a very, very shady paddock. So lots and lots of trees in her paddock. But she will come up after a day of grazing in hot weather for their feed in the late afternoons. And she'll nearly always you'll be able to see just sort of sweat and salt crusted on her coat from the amount that she's been sweating. So she also sun bleaches really badly. And in fact, I have photos of her from last summer where down beside her tail, so on her rump on either side of her tail, it had also bleached out to an almost golden colour. What's confusing about the horse's sun bleach is that not every horse will do it. So my Dellinger, the little paint that I spoke about earlier, who has the very rough coat, the very rough winter coat when it's change of season time, but then when it all comes out, she's just this glorious, almost black underneath as well. She has not bleached in that same time frame. So they're living in the exact same environment. They have a nearly identical diet. And in fact, Alay, the thoroughbred who does bleach, is getting some full-fat soybean, and she's also on oil, different things to try and keep her coat in as good condition as possible, whereas Dellinger doesn't get any of those things. And yet Dellinger doesn't bleach. So it can be a little bit tricky looking at horses and thinking, well, why is your coat look ordinary and why doesn't yours? And thinking that maybe there's something wrong with the one or two horses in your herd that have got ordinary coats. And there may be, so you do still need to consider, well, is there something wrong with these horses? But in this situation with these two horses, I absolutely know that they're on balanced diets and they're in pristine health otherwise. And yet the Poet and Alay both bleach in the sun, and no one else in the herd does. So, and it's been interesting for me. My daughter normally rides Alay, but she had to have a surprise surgery, nothing major, but it was one that just meant she couldn't ride for a number of weeks, and she had a competition coming up. So I was riding Alay for her and noticing how much she sweats. So it takes very, very little to get Alay to actually break out in quite a significant sweat when you're riding her. Where Dellinger, I've been riding quite a lot in the last little while as well, and it takes an awful lot to get her to sweat. A lot. So we did a lot of work yesterday afternoon, and it was reasonably cool. It was beautiful weather for riding in, but she still was only just the slightest of slight damp underneath her saddlecloth, and just the tiniest little bit of sweat on her neck and shoulders. And that was it. So it makes me wonder whether, and I know this is, just observations in my herd, but it's often where for things like this, I make the best observations because I know the horses so well. But it does make me wonder, and something for you to consider as well, is if you have a horse that sweats a lot and they're also exposed to the elements out in the sunshine a lot, and they get a coat that goes bleached or loses colour, particularly in summer, and particularly also too, pay attention to where the colour gets lost the most. Is it in the areas of their body or underneath their saddlecloth where they sweat the most? Is quite likely just sun bleaching. And really the only thing we can do about that is keep them out of the sun. So having rugs on them, or I don't like to keep horses in stables. I like to have them as much as possible just being horses, but yes, it's definitely an option to keep them. If you've got horses that is very, very important for them to have pristine coats, then maybe keeping them in the day but letting them out at night to graze is an option for you to stop them from bleaching. But I'm super glad, super grateful to Poet for helping me figure that out just by not bleaching underneath his fly mask. And yeah, it's something that I see quite often now, and definitely noticing the differences between my own horses in my herd. I should mention Popcorn too, who's this beautiful light bay, like a caramel bay almost. You can do anything to her coat, and she does sweat. So she's more of a sweater than Dellinger is, but honestly, you could do anything to her coat and it never changes colour. So there's lots of obviously genetic variation, individual variation when we talk about coat colour and what we need to do for certain horses. So do keep that in mind. Lots of individual variation, and what works for one horse is not necessarily going to work for another. and you just kind of have to figure out what it is that might be going on for your horses. But to go back to the nutrient deficiency, the one thing, if you've got a horse that does have a bleach coat, the one thing that I really want to rule out quickly is that they don't have a nutrient deficiency. So if you're not 100% sure that your horse's requirements for all nutrients, including copper and zinc, are met, and they've got a bleach coat, then chances are good that it's actually a nutrient deficiency and not bleaching. But if you like in my situation where I know that all of my horses have got their copper and zinc requirements well and truly covered, and there's a couple of them that are bleaching, I put it down to some bleaching. Okay. The next factor that might make your horse's coats look pretty ordinary is different health challenges. So we do need to be aware when assessing our horse's coats and trying to figure out why they might look a little bit ordinary, is that there are certain diseases that will make their coats look rough, dull, bleached out, all kinds of yuck, I guess, for want of a technical word. This is not an exhaustive list, so you do need to keep in mind that, like I said at the beginning, a shiny coat is an indication that horses are very healthy, and with the exception of some bleaching and change of season, a dull, rough, ordinary-looking coat can definitely be an indication that that horse is not healthy on the inside. So I'll just mention a few diseases specifically. So the first one, its long name is secondary nutritional hyperparathyroidism, also more commonly known as big head disease. So this is the disease that is caused by high oxalate warm season grasses. So grasses like buffel grass, kikuyu, soteria, there's quite a number of them. Couch grass or Bermuda grass will cause this disease as well if fed with a diet that is not providing enough calcium. So essentially what happens is horses eat these grasses, they can't absorb the calcium from the grasses and they become very calcium deficient, and then they start to pull calcium from their bones and they get very weak bones. So that's the worst outcome from that disease. But horses that are affected by it will often have very rough coats and a whole heap of other problems. Like they'll be very sore and they'll start to lose weight, and generally their hoof condition is quite poor as well. But so if your horses are rough coated and you live in an area where warm season grasses are abundant, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you live in a warm climate. There's lots of these warm season grasses that will grow in cooler climates as well. Do just check your grasses. We do have a list of these grasses in the My Happy Horse app. And in fact, when you are doing diets for your horses in there, it will ask you if you have any of those grasses in your pasture so that it can balance up calcium levels properly for your horse. But yeah, definitely a rough coat is one of the symptoms of that condition. The next condition, they've all got big long names, but pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, so abbreviated to PPID, and also more commonly known as Cushing's disease. So this will give you a really overt poor coat condition. So these horses will get very long, shaggy coats. It's often wavy. And another feature of this disease is that they don't want to shed their coats when they should coming into summer. So one of our gorgeous, very early adopters of My Happy Horse, Wendy, just sent me some photos of a horse that she's struggling with this morning. And I was like, oh my goodness, Wendy, I think this horse might have Cushing's disease, which I was actually excited to realise because in without seeing the horse, she had all sorts of different issues and like finding it very difficult to bring things like some laminitis under control and thrush and weight loss and things like that, and I couldn't figure it out. I said over the phone, this it's unusual for a laminitic horse to lose weight very quickly. I didn't think of Cushing's disease at the time, but when I saw the photo of her, this long wavy coat, and Wendy described her as looking like a shaggy dog, and she did look a little bit like a shaggy dog. But when you can bring that disease under control, work closely with your veterinarian to do that. There's medications that those horses can go on to bring their hormonal systems back under control, and you'll see that their coat condition improves a lot, as does all the other health conditions that they struggle with as well, that are caused by their hormones being all out of whack with that disease. So rough, shaggy coat and a coat that won't shed is definitely a red flag for Cushing's disease, and you need to talk to your vet about that one. There's blood tests that they can do to give a definitive diagnosis, and then there's lots of things you can do to manage it, and it makes them much healthier, much happier little horses with a much healthier coat, which is a bonus and tells you that they're feeling better. Gastric ulceration is another disease condition that can cause a rough coat, but it's a really tricky one, and so are worm burdens. So worm burdens can also cause a rough coat, partly because the worms can actually suck so much nutrient and steal so much nutrient from your horse, and they can cause malabsorption, and they can also cause protein leakage into the gut, that horses just become protein deficient and then they can't maintain a healthy coat. But the tricky thing with both of those conditions, so gastric ulcers and also worm burdens, is that horses that have either quite severe gastric ulcers or heavy worm burdens are not necessarily going to have a poor coat. So it's not, a shiny coat is not necessarily an indication that your horse doesn't have gastric ulcers or doesn't have worms. So to give you an example of that, actually I've got a couple of examples of that. There was a little horse we had here for a little while. I'm trying to think of her name now. That's terrible. I've forgotten her name. Anyway, she came to live with us for a little while because she had terrible gastric ulcers. It was during COVID lockdowns. It was very, very difficult to get gastroscopes. In fact, it was impossible to get gastroscopes done. But we had her here for a period of time to see if just through feeding and nutrition we could actually get her ulcers to resolve. Well, she looked an absolute picture. She had the shiniest coat, and she was in beautiful condition, and she seemed reasonably happy in herself. We weren't riding her, but she seemed, when we were handling her on the ground, she seemed reasonably happy in herself. When we could eventually get her in for a gastroscope, and I remember the day because it was flooding, and I'm like, I'm not missing this opportunity to gastroscope this horse. And I was driving not through dangerous floodwater, but through reasonably deep, but it wasn't moving, but through reasonably deep floodwater to get her to the vet. She was still really badly ulcerated. So despite the fact that she was glowing, I've got photos of her still on my phone. She was absolutely glowing in the coat, and yet she was still really badly ulcerated and had both glandular and squamous ulcers. So her whole stomach was ulcerated. And then the second example is Spotty the pony, who is not Spotty. Her real name's Spotlight, and she's pitch black. I think her name is that because you need a spotlight at night to find her. But she carries a heavy worm burden. Every single time I fecal egg count her, she's got a heavy worm burden. So they were just done in September, and her fecal egg count came back at 1,200. It was really high. Most of the horses were 0, and a couple of them were 300 something, and hers was up over 1,200. And yet, to look at her, pitch black and brilliantly shiny. So you would never have looked at her. And in fact, I wish I had a photo of Dellinger, the little paint who gets the very rough coat at the end of winter, standing beside Spotty the pony, because Dellinger looked like she had worms, and yet her fecal egg count was 0. And Spotty looked $1 million, and her fecal egg count was 1,200. So it can be really misleading. Don't use coat health to diagnose the presence of a number of diseases, but particularly gastric ulcers and worm burdens, because horses can be, labouring under those conditions and yet not be showing it in their coat. And the last little thing I want to mention, and it certainly applies to my horses, and I know that it will apply to others' horses, is the last factor that might make horses' coats look a bit ordinary is are they just dirty? So I've mentioned earlier that none of my horses are rugged, and sometimes I look at them. In fact, often I look at them and think, your coats are not looking that great. But for various reasons, be it, we might be doing some video work or heading off to a show, for whatever the reason, we'll give them a bath and throw a cotton rug on in summer, or a warmer winter rug on if it's cold, to keep them clean. And the next morning, it's like magic. Their coats are beautiful and shiny and lovely. So, the combination of being clean and then having the rug just sitting on top of the coat and sort of almost like polishing it up overnight makes a massive difference. So if you are looking at your horse's coat and your horse is unrugged, it's a good thing just to go and give them a shampoo, throw a rug on them overnight and check the coat the next day. And this is more, I guess, in the situation where you know that everything else is right. You know that they don't have a disease condition. You know that their diets are well balanced, so they don't have a nutrient deficiency. And it's not sun bleaching, and you're just struggling to figure out why your horse's coat looks not as good as you would like it to. Just check and see if maybe it is just dirt, particularly if your horses are living outside and unrugged. So that covers off my list of things that might be making your horse's coat look a little bit ordinary. I want to spend just a little bit of time now on feeding for a glowing coat. So feeding for beautiful coats. And really it's all the same things we need to do to feed for a healthy horse. So at the very, very top of the list is feed a properly balanced diet. And what I mean by properly balanced is that you have the correct amount of forage and fibers in your horse's diet. So much of horses' health and I think so much of what turns up in their coats being beautiful and shiny comes from their gut health. And we get really good gut health when we feed lots of forage, as much as possible. Feed, I mean, if you can get away with a forage-based diet that has very little of anything else in it, then that's great, because that's a horse's natural way of being. I talk a lot about that in episode 1 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast. So feeding your horse like a horse. And it is the way to their healthiest horses possible, is just feeding them as much forage and fiber in their diet as you can. So when I say balanced diet, is the forage, is there enough forage, and also is it in a good balance with the other ingredients in the diet. So as an example, on the flip side, if your horse is on a high grain diet and there's not very much forage in the diet, that becomes an ingredient imbalance. There's too much grain, too much starch, and not nearly enough forage and fiber in that horse's diet to keep their gut healthy and therefore to keep the horse healthy. So check that as your first part of a balanced diet. And then the other part of a balanced diet is making sure that the diet is actually meeting all of the horse's requirements for the various nutrients that they need. So, protein and amino acids and macro minerals, trace minerals and vitamins are all super important. So your horse needs all of the nutrients all of the nutrients we know about, plus a whole lot of nutrients we actually don't really know a whole lot about. And I talk about ingredient variety in episode 24 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast. So we use feeding lots of different ingredients in a horse's diet as a way to make sure that we are meeting all of the nutrient requirements that we don't really understand very well in a horse's diet. And then we use fortified feeds and vitamin and mineral supplements to make sure that we're getting those really critical nutrients like copper and zinc that we've talked a lot about into a horse's diet. It is a lot to balance up, and this is exactly why My Happy Horse, the nutrition app, exists, because it's so hard to do all of this maths in your head. And honestly, it's so nice to be able to look and go, oh, I can see my horse is getting enough forage. There's not too much grain, and that the requirements for protein and amino acids and all the different vitamins and minerals are met. So it's a brilliant tool. And just gives you that confidence. Like I've said a number of times during this podcast, I know my horses are getting everything they need. And the reason I know that is because I can see it in the calculations that I do on their diet. I absolutely know that they're getting the nutrients that they need in their diet. So that's the first thing, feed a properly balanced diet. And encompassed in that is making sure that you feed for good gut health. So if you want to learn more and listen some more around gut health, there's episode 2, Journey Down Your Horse's Gastrointestinal Tract. Great one to go back and listen to. And also episode 10 has 4 rules for a healthy hindgut, and they'll help you really start to think in detail about feeding for gut health with your horses. And it's, if you can get your horse to have a healthy gut, you've got almost the battle of good nutrition won for your horse. Next thing you can do, thinking specifically about feeding for coat health, is to add some oil to your horse's diet. So making sure that you've got an underlying balanced diet, but then adding some oil on top, and the oil can help to bring out a really glistening, shiny coat. So I tend towards flaxseed oil if horses are on higher grain diets. So for a standard size 500 kilo horse, I classify a higher grain diet as anything more than 3 kilos or 6.6 pounds for an 1,100 pound horse, if you speak in pounds. And I tend towards flaxseed oil in those horses because grains are high in omega-6, so you don't really need to be or want to be adding more omega-6 into those diets. And flaxseed oil is wonderfully rich in omega-3 and much lower in, or very, very low in omega-6. So bringing flaxseed oil in brings lots of omega-3 into those horses that have already got a fair bit of omega-6 from the grain. If horses are on near forage only diets, so they're out grazing and they might just get a small amount of a balancer pellet or a vitamin and mineral supplement each day, then I often will tend towards canola oil, because it's about 20% omega-6, 10% omega-3. So it's reasonably low in omega-6 compared to something like sunflower oil or corn oil, which are, up over, I've forgotten the exact numbers off the top of my head, but 50, 60% omega-6. So canola oil brings in a nice bit of omega-6 for horses that are on forage only, and it also still brings in some omega-3. So I like it for horses that are on almost forage only diets. Or you can get a bit more technical, I guess, and add some canola oil together with flaxseed oil, and then you'll be adding, still a small amount of omega-6, but a higher level of omega-3 when you use a blend of those two oils together. Next thing is to manage diseases carefully. So do work really closely with your veterinarian to manage the complex diseases like the PPID or Cushing's disease and gastric ulcers. Make sure that your diets are balanced for calcium. If you are on warm season grasses that are high in oxalate, so that you are preventing diseases like big head disease. And it's a really good idea to use regular fecal egg counts and very strategic worming to stay on top of any worm burdens, to make sure that you are that your horses don't have worms, and that the worms aren't affecting your horse's health and therefore affecting their coat condition. And the last little thing, which is not feeding, but if you do have a horse that bleaches badly and coat color is important, so if it's a show horse, for example, and coat color is very important, then do provide plenty of access to shade. Make sure you hose them off really, really well. So after work, getting that salt out of the coat, because it's the combination of the salt and the sun that is bleaching them. So making sure that you keep their coats as clean as possible does help. And then completely up to you to use UV blocking rugs, or making sure that they're under shelter during sunlight hours, and making sure, of course, that they've always got something to chew on if they're in a stable or in a shelter during the day to keep them out of the sun. Please make sure that they've always got hay, so that you don't cause gastric ulceration and boredom and other behavioural issues that come with not having free access to fibre. So that brings us to the end of our feeding for coat condition. Just as a quick little recap, if your horse's coat is not looking as beautiful as you would like it to, then do go through your little checklist of, is it change of season? Could it be nutrient deficiency? Might it be sun bleaching? Are there any health challenges they're being affected by? Is it just that they're dirty? And then once you've ruled in or ruled out any of those conditions, you can look at feeding for a beautiful coat. And absolutely number one is feeding a properly balanced diet, making sure that forage to grain ratios are correct, and also making sure that all nutrient requirements are being met. Make sure that the gut is healthy and that you are feeding in a way to support gut health. Certainly adding some oil is a nice little, I guess, helping hand that you can use. And actually, I'll throw a bonus one in here too. ingredients like full fat soybean, bringing in natural oils and also really high quality protein. It's also a beautiful ingredient when you are feeding for coat condition. I use it a lot in say yearlings under yearling prep conditions to get their muscles right, but also their coat condition. It helps with a lot as well. So, and then yes, make sure you look for and rule out any diseases that may be affecting them, and if there is any present, then managing them and providing access to plenty of shade and keeping any of these frustrating horses that sun bleach out of the sun. So I hope that helps. Would love you to go and check out the My Happy Horse Nutrition app. It is now in the App Store, or you can go to our website, myhappy.horse. Free to download, and you can check it out. Everything works in the free version, other than the very detailed nutrition analysis. So yeah, would love you to go on and check out the app and use it to balance your horse's diet and help them have glorious, shiny coats. Until next time, keep your horses happy, healthy, and shiny.